two brothers bought an old mansion for pennies to quickly resell it. But in the attic, they found something that changed everything. See how one discovery turned an ordinary renovation into a story that the whole town is talking about. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The house stood at the end of a narrow road where the trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a green tunnel that filtered the light into soft gold. When the truck of the Morgan brothers finally stopped in front of it, the engine rattled for a moment and died, leaving only the slow chirp of insects and the sigh of the summer wind. The silence was heavier than either of them expected. For a few seconds, they simply stared. It had been listed for months on the county auction page, a 3-story Victorian house in Mill Creek, Ohio, sold by the city for unpaid taxes. $24,000. The photographs had made it look almost noble, if a bit forgotten. In person, it was something else. The porch sagged to one side, the windows gaped like empty eyes, and ivy had climbed so far up the facade that it seemed to be swallowing the structure whole. The shutters hung crooked, and the iron gate leaned as if tired of standing guard. Still, to Jack Morgan, it was perfect. Cheap, big, and full of potential profit. "We can fix it," he said, his voice steady and sure, the tone of a man who had spent too many years saying the same about less promising ruins. A coat of paint, new floors, new wiring, done in 6 months. We sell. We start the company for real. Beside him, his twin brother Ray stood quietly, his arms folded. He was the taller of the two, leaner, his skin browned by sun and sawdust. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the columns, the carved lintels, the arched window over the door. There was beauty there, though buried beneath years of neglect. "She's seen better days," he finally said softly. "But she's still standing." That was how it began, their first independent project. After years of building other people's dreams, they were about to build their own. For the first few weeks, they lived in the house itself. There was no heat, no running water, beyond what they could pull from the old well behind the property. At night, the boards creaked under their boots, and the smell of mildew lingered in the air. They worked from dawn until the last light faded, ripping out rotted beams, replacing sections of flooring, rewiring outlets that had long since crumbled. The rooms echoed with the clang of hammers, the buzz of saws, and the brothers' constant back and forth. Jack's voice, sharp, impatient, Ray's calm but firm. Jack had always been the planner, the one who kept the books, counted the hours, and cursed the costs. Ray was the craftsman, slower but meticulous, never able to pass a warped board or uneven line without fixing it. Their differences made them effective as a team and exhausting as brothers. Every night, after hours of labor, they would sit in the empty living room among stacks of lumber and discuss the future. Jack talked about potential buyers and profit margins. Ray talked about the history of the place, how someone had once carved the initials HC into the banister, how the house must have been built by hands that cared. It was Ray who found the first clue. He was clearing debris from what had once been a study, a small room with a broken window and a heavy oak desk. Beneath a pile of old newspapers, he found a wooden box filled with brushes, their bristles stiff with age. There were half-used tubes of oil paint, their labels faded, but still readable. He found a rusted palette knife and a cracked porcelain cup stained with dark pigment. On the wall, faint rectangles of cleaner paint marked where frames had once hung. The discovery didn't seem like much at first, but Ray lingered there longer than he meant to, running his fingers over the dust. "This was someone's studio," he murmured. Jack, who had come in to check the measurements, barely looked up. Whoever it was, they're long gone. What matters is square footage. Ray didn't argue, but that night, lying on his mattress near the window, he kept thinking of the empty space on the wall, the missing paintings, the feeling that someone had once filled this place with more than just silence. Days blurred into weeks. They worked through the lower floors, fixing what they could, closing off what they couldn't yet afford to repair. It wasn't until they reached the top of the second floor that Ray noticed something odd. At the end of the hallway was a section of ceiling that didn't quite match the rest. A small trap door, nailed shut and painted over. Above it, faint drafts whispered through the cracks. "There's something up there," he said one afternoon, pointing at the spot. Jack, who was carrying a bundle of planks, sighed. "An attic. Every old house has one. Probably just insulation and raccoons. Then it won't hurt to check." Jack didn't want to waste a day tearing open ceilings, but Ray had that quiet stubbornness that meant there would be no peace until he got his way. Together, they pried away the nails, one by one, until the hatch loosened. A cloud of stale dust fell over them, smelling of oil and age. A narrow staircase rose into the darkness above. They fetched a flashlight and climbed. The attic was larger than they expected, stretching nearly the full length of the house. The light beam cut through the gloom, revealing a scene that stopped them both. There, lined neatly against the walls, were small wooden markers, names carved by hand, dates. Next to them, urns, some ceramic, some metal, some nothing more than sealed jars. Between them stood easels, canvases, and boxes full of rolled-up paintings. The air was thick with the scent of old turpentine. Jack swore under his breath. "What the hell is this?" Ray walked forward slowly, the floor creaking beneath him. His flashlight fell on one of the markers. Clara, 1942 to 1978. Another read, Daniel, 1965 to 1979. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with ghosts, only the strange intimacy of finding grief preserved like this. "It's not a graveyard," he said quietly. "It's a memorial." Jack shook his head. "It's creepy. We'll have to clear it out before we sell. Can't show the house with this stuff here." But Ray had already crouched beside a stack of canvases. He unrolled one carefully, brushing off the dust. The image that emerged was a portrait, a woman and a boy, standing in a field of pale grass. The brushwork was delicate, the faces tender and alive. In the corner, barely visible, was a signature, Henry Collins, 1974. He looked around again, at the brushes, the palettes, the jars. It all fit. "He lived here," Ray said. "He painted them here." Jack turned away. "Doesn't matter. He's gone." "Maybe. But look at this." On the back of the painting, scrawled in faint pencil, were the words, "My family is still here." For a long moment, neither spoke. Dust drifted in the beam of light. Then Jack muttered, "We're not keeping it." Ray didn't answer. He rolled the canvas back up, gently, and placed it on the table beside the urns. That night, after Jack had gone to bed, he returned to the attic alone. He sat on the floor, opening the small notebook he'd found on the artist's desk. The pages were brittle, filled with uneven handwriting. "I paint so they will live. If the world forgets, the house won't." Ray read until the flashlight began to dim. The wind outside rattled the roof, and the boards creaked softly beneath him. For the first time since buying the property, he felt the strange sense that the house was not empty at all, not haunted, not supernatural, but still alive in the quiet way of places that have been loved too deeply to die. When he finally turned off the light, he whispered into the dark, "We'll figure out who you were." Downstairs, Jack shifted in his sleep, unaware that something had already changed. The project was no longer just a renovation. It had become a conversation between the living and the remembered, between profit and purpose. And as dawn began to lighten the cracked windows, the house at the end of the road stood waiting for whatever would come next. Autumn settled quietly over Mill Creek, and the house on the hill seemed to absorb every shade of it. The maples along the road burned red. The air carried the smell of dry leaves and cold iron, and each morning, mist hung low across the fields like a soft white blanket. Inside the house, the Morgan brothers worked through the chill, their breaths fogging in the unheated rooms as the project moved from foundation to finish. Yet the attic remained untouched, as if it existed on a different timeline altogether, one that neither of them fully understood. Ray had begun spending his evenings up there, sorting through the paintings, reading the notebooks he had found in a drawer. He discovered pages full of sketches, hands, faces, the outlines of a woman's hair, and half-written notes about pigments and brush techniques. Sometimes the entries turned personal, memories of Clara, the wife, and Daniel, the boy. One sentence, written in careful cursive, stayed with him. "I will not bury them twice." That was when he realized the urns were not hidden out of shame, but preserved as the last trace of love a man had to give. Downstairs, Jack grew restless. The budget was thinning, and every day lost to curiosity felt like a blow. He kept receipts in a notebook, scribbling totals late into the night, while Ray sat silently by the fireplace, hands stained with dust and old paint. "You can't build profit out of ghosts," Jack said once, half in frustration, half in exhaustion. "We've got permits to renew, pipes to replace, walls to plaster. Those ashes won't pay the bills." Ray didn't argue. He just said, "They already paid for this house once. Maybe they deserve a little of our time." It was the kind of answer that made Jack grind his teeth and go outside to smoke. When winter crept closer, Ray decided to visit the county records office. He told Jack he was picking up building paperwork, but instead, he asked the archivist about Henry Collins. The woman behind the counter, a gray-haired local who seemed to know every name that had ever passed through the town, took her time flipping through faded files. "Henry?" she said. "Yes, I remember that name. Art teacher, lived on Ridge Lane. Quiet man. His wife and boy died in a car wreck, late 70s. After that, no one saw much of him. He stopped painting for a while, then never stopped again. Some said he went a little mad, but maybe he just stayed faithful." She slid a yellowed article across the desk. Local artist exhibits portraits of the lost Henry Collins opens Faces of Memory at Mill Creek Library, 1978. There was a grainy photograph of a thin man beside his paintings, the caption almost unreadable. The show had closed after a week. No one had bought a thing. Ray drove back through the falling light, the newspaper folded on the passenger seat, feeling the faint ache of connection between two men separated by time. When he reached the house, Jack was outside, hammering nails into new porch beams. "Did you get the permits?" Jack called. Ray nodded, hiding the article in his coat pocket. He didn't know why, but it felt like something fragile, something that needed protecting. That night, after dinner, he brought a small portable heater up to the attic and started cleaning the paintings more carefully. He used rags dampened with linseed oil, brushing away the dust that had buried the colors for decades. One by one, the portraits emerged from the gloom. Clara's soft smile, Daniel's small hand gripping a toy horse, the outlines of a garden in spring. The light from the bulb overhead was weak, but it was enough to make the colors breathe again. He thought about the line in the notebook. "If the world forgets, the house won't," and whispered, "Not anymore." The next morning, while Ray worked upstairs, Jack was in the basement repairing the old boiler. Every clang echoed through the pipes, a rhythm of frustration. He was tired of the silence between them, of Ray's quiet detours from the plan. When he finally climbed up to the attic to check the progress, he froze at the sight. Paintings leaned against every wall, and Ray was crouched over a stack of them, his clothes streaked with grime and color. The air smelled of oil and age. "What are you doing?" Jack demanded. "You're wasting time on dead people?" Ray didn't look up. "I'm trying to keep something alive." That's not our job. Our job is to finish this place, get it listed, and move on. You think buyers want an attic full of urns and portraits of strangers? They're not strangers anymore, Ray said quietly. He painted them because no one else would remember. Isn't that what we're doing too? Fixing what everyone else forgot? Jack rubbed his forehead, exasperated. You're losing it, Ray. These people are gone. We need money, not sentiment. The argument ended the way most of their arguments did, with Jack storming off and Ray sitting in the silence he left behind. But that night, Jack lay awake longer than usual. Through the floorboards, he could hear faint footsteps above Ray moving carefully, almost reverently, across the attic. The thought irritated him, but beneath the irritation, there was a trace of curiosity he couldn't quite shake. A week later, curiosity found its way into the open. Ray had taken a photograph of one of the restored paintings, a portrait of Clara, the woman with dark eyes, and posted it online in a forum for builders, mentioning how they had found it during renovation. He didn't expect much, maybe a few polite comments. Instead, one reply stood out. That looks like a Henry Collins piece. Are you sure it's original? The message came from someone named Allison Reed, who introduced herself as a researcher from the Regional Museum in Columbus. She asked if she could visit. When Ray told Jack, his brother nearly dropped his coffee. You invited a stranger to come dig through our attic? She's not a stranger. She works for a museum. Even worse. They'll bring paperwork, restrictions, God knows what else. She just wants to see the paintings. Jack groaned but didn't stop him. Maybe, deep down, he hoped this obsession would burn itself out once Ray realized no one cared about forgotten artists. But when Allison arrived, a young woman with short hair, paint-stained jeans, and a careful, intelligent gaze, everything began to change. She spent hours in the attic, cataloging each piece, taking photographs, asking questions. She treated the paintings not as relics, but as living things. Ray watched her trace her fingers along the faded signatures, whispering, "They're real." When she finished, she turned to him with a look of wonder. "You have no idea what you found. Henry Collins wasn't famous, but his work was part of a small realist movement in Ohio. A few collectors have been looking for his later pieces for years. Some of these could be worth a fortune." Jack, who had come upstairs out of curiosity, crossed his arms. "A fortune, you say?" Allison nodded. "If they're authenticated, yes. Especially the family portraits. They're personal, emotional. That's what makes them rare." Jack's practical mind began to calculate numbers before she even finished speaking, but Ray's thoughts went elsewhere. "He didn't paint them to sell," he said. "He painted them to keep them close." Allison smiled faintly. Sometimes love makes better art than ambition. After she left, Jack followed Ray out to the porch. The cold was sharp, the evening sky a pale silver. "So," Jack said, trying to sound casual, "you think we could actually make money off those?" Ray didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the empty fields. "Maybe. But that's not why we should do it." Jack frowned. "Then why?" "To finish what he started. He kept their memory here. We could help show it to the world." Jack didn't reply. He went back inside, pretending to check invoices, but the thought lingered. That night, while Ray slept, he went up to the attic himself. The paintings were lined neatly against the walls, their faces half lit by the moon through the cracked window. For the first time, he didn't see ghosts or losses. He saw effort, skill, devotion, a kind of craftsmanship he could respect. It was a strange feeling, admiration mixed with unease. Days passed, and Allison returned with supplies for cleaning and preservation. She and Ray worked side by side, gently wiping each canvas, stretching torn fabric, repairing frames. Jack continued his part of the renovation, painting walls, installing fixtures, But the atmosphere of the house began to shift. It was no longer a project to flip, but a story unfolding beneath their hands. When the first snow fell, they decided to test the market. Allison suggested bringing one painting, a smaller portrait of Daniel, to a regional auction. Jack agreed reluctantly, half expecting disappointment. But when the gavel came down and the painting sold for $18,000, even he stood speechless. Ray didn't smile, only exhaled softly, as if the air had been held too long inside him. That night, over a quiet dinner, Jack finally said, "Maybe you were right." Ray looked at him. "About what?" "About not throwing them away." Ray nodded. He deserved better. Jack hesitated, then added, "So do we. Maybe we can do both." The next morning, they loaded the urns into the truck. The day was bright and cold, the snow glinting on the road as they drove to the town cemetery. They found a quiet spot near the edge, where the trees leaned low over the ground. Together, without words, they dug a shallow space and placed the urns side by side. Ray set a simple stone marker above them, engraved with the name Henry Collins, and family their home still stands. When they returned to the house, neither spoke for a long time. The attic was different now, lighter somehow, as if the air itself had cleared. Ray wrote a small sign and nailed it to one of the beams. Henry Collins' studio, a place where memory stayed true. Jack read it once and didn't object. For the first time since they'd arrived, they worked without arguing. The house, once heavy with dust and sorrow, began to breathe again. Fresh paint covered the walls, the stairs shone with new polish, and the faint smell of oil paint still lingered upstairs like a heartbeat. Jack, while finishing the front door, paused to look up at the window of the attic. He thought he saw the faint glimmer of the restored canvases inside, and felt something close to pride. Weeks later, when he caught Ray sitting on the porch at dusk, staring out at the quiet street, Jack joined him. They didn't talk about profits or timelines. The project that had started as a job had become something else entirely. The house was no longer just theirs. It belonged to the people who had lived, loved, and been remembered within its walls. And when the night fell and the lamps inside flickered to life, it felt less like a renovation and more like a resurrection, not of the dead, but of meaning itself. Spring returned to Mill Creek as if the town had been holding its breath all winter. The snow melted slowly from the rooftops. The trees along Ridge Lane grew pale buds, and the house that had once seemed destined to collapse began to glow faintly in the new light. Inside, the air no longer smelled of dust or decay, but of varnish, fresh paint, and clean wood. The walls gleamed softly under the golden bulbs that Jack had finally installed, and the echo of hammers had been replaced by a steady, peaceful silence. For the first time in years, the house didn't look abandoned. It looked like a place that belonged to someone again. Jack stood at the gate one morning, his hands in his pockets, watching a moving truck back out of the driveway. The workers had just delivered the last set of polished benches for the second-floor landing, custom-made by Ray from leftover oak planks. The house was finished. Every nail, every hinge, every inch of molding had been touched by their hands. It had taken longer than either of them had planned and cost more than they wanted to admit, but it stood there now as proof that something forgotten could still be reborn. Ray came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee, his face lined with quiet satisfaction. "She's done," he said simply. Jack nodded. He had stopped correcting his brother when he referred to the house as she. There was something about this place that had earned the right to be spoken of like a living thing. They stood side by side for a while, looking up at the windows. From one of them, high under the slanted roof, the faint gleam of glass reflected the morning sun. The attic window, now clean and repaired, where Henry Collins' studio remained exactly as they had found it, only lighter, warmer, and alive with the restored canvases hanging in perfect rows. The official opening was set for the following Saturday. Allison Reed had helped arrange it through the regional museum, working with the town council to register the house as a local heritage property. What had begun as a renovation had quietly transformed into a cultural restoration. The announcement in the newspaper read, "The Collins House, a private gallery, opens to honor a forgotten artist." Jack had read the article twice, still half disbelieving that their names were printed beside it, as restorers. Ray didn't care much for the publicity. He only cared that people would finally see the paintings in the light they deserved. In the week leading up to the event, they worked on the final touches. Jack repainted the front steps one last time, covering every scuff left by the workers. Ray built wooden frames for the photographs Allison had found, black and white images of Henry Collins and his family, recovered from the archives. They hung them in the hallway leading to the attic, each picture accompanied by a small plaque, engraved with a brief story. Clara Collins, wife and muse. Daniel Collins, beloved son. Henry, in his studio, 1979. The photographs gave the house a pulse, as if the walls themselves were whispering thank you. On the morning of the opening, sunlight poured through the clean windows, turning the floorboards honey gold. Cars lined the street for the first time in decades, and the low hum of voices filled the air. Town residents, art lovers from Columbus, and even a few reporters gathered at the front gate. Allison moved through the crowd gracefully, answering questions, directing people inside. Jack stood near the porch, wearing the one decent jacket he owned, shaking hands with strangers who congratulated him. He didn't quite know what to say to them. Ray stayed in the background, quietly guiding small groups through the house, explaining the restoration process, describing how they had found the paintings under layers of dust. He spoke simply, never embellishing, letting the story of the house tell itself. When the guests reached the attic, there was always the same hush. The room had been left mostly as it was, the beams sanded and sealed, the window repaired, the floor polished, but still uneven in places. The urns were gone, buried properly now in the town cemetery, but a small plaque by the window read, "In loving memory of the Collins family, whose presence built this house and never left it." Around the room hung the restored paintings, glowing softly in their frames. Each portrait seemed to look back at the visitors with quiet dignity. Some people smiled, others grew still, and a few wiped tears. Ray watched their faces more than the art itself. That was where he saw the real proof that what they had done mattered. Jack gave a short speech at Allison's insistence. He wasn't a man of words, but he managed to find a few that felt true. "We came here to build something we could sell," he said, his voice rough but steady. "We didn't know we'd find someone who'd already built something better. Henry Collins gave this house its heart. All we did was listen long enough to hear it beat again." There was applause, and Jack glanced toward Ray, who nodded once in quiet approval. For a man who had always measured success in dollars, it felt strange to realize that pride could weigh more than money. After the crowd thinned and the reporters left, the brothers and Allison sat in the front room with paper cups of coffee. The house felt calm again, its silence no longer heavy but full. Allison smiled and told them that several collectors had already inquired about buying prints or licensing the gallery for exhibitions. Jack raised an eyebrow. "So this could actually bring in something?" She nodded. "More than you think. But whatever happens, what you did here is bigger than profit." Ray looked up at the staircase, where the afternoon light slanted through the window and painted the banister in gold. "It's not really ours anymore," he said softly. It belongs to him, and maybe to anyone who needs to remember something good. Allison agreed. Places like this remind people that love leaves a mark you can still touch. A few weeks later, when the paperwork was finalized and the last checks cleared, the brothers finally took a day off. They sat on the porch, the tools packed away, the dust settled. The air was warm and the fields were green again. Jack leaned back in his chair, watching a car pull up at the gate. A family of 3 stepping out, their young daughter holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "Visitors," Ray said. The little girl carried the flowers up the steps and handed them to him, explaining shyly that her art teacher had told her about the house, and she wanted to see where the paintings lived. Ray thanked her and placed the bouquet in a jar near the door. Jack smiled to himself, and for once said nothing practical or cynical. In the following months, the Collins house became a quiet landmark. Travelers stopped to take photographs, school groups visited to learn about restoration, and sometimes artists came to sketch in the attic. Jack and Ray continued their work, forming a small company they named Morgan Restorations. Their reputation grew not just for craftsmanship, but for care. They weren't known as quick builders anymore, but as men who could bring history back to life. For Jack, that was a kind of success he had never imagined wanting. One evening, near the end of summer, the brothers returned to the house to close it for the day. The gallery had emptied, the guests gone, and the light outside was the deep amber of sunset. They walked through each room slowly, checking the windows, the locks, the switches, as they always did. When they reached the attic, Ray paused. The paintings glowed softly in the dim light. On the far wall hung the last piece they had restored, the self-portrait of Henry Collins. In it, the painter stood in his studio, brush in hand, the faint image of Clara and Daniel behind him, like memories refusing to fade. The resemblance between the attic in the painting and the one they stood in was uncanny. It felt almost like a mirror across time. Jack stepped closer, looking at the brushwork, the soft way the artist had painted the light falling on his own hands. He knew this was all he had left, Jack said quietly, and he made it enough. Ray nodded. He did what we're all trying to do, leave something standing. They stood there for a long moment, the house creaking gently around them, the scent of linseed and oak filling the air. Then Ray reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. A picture Allison had taken on the day of the opening. It showed the 2 of them standing together outside the gate, their clothes dusty, the newly restored house behind them. Without a word, he hung it beside the self-portrait, aligning the frames so that the old and the new seemed to share the same horizon. When he stepped back, Jack exhaled softly. "You think he'd mind?" Ray smiled. "I think he'd understand." They turned off the lights, leaving only the faint reflection of the evening sky through the window. As they descended the stairs, the house seemed to settle into a deep, peaceful quiet. Outside, the fields shimmered under the fading sun, and the first fireflies flickered among the tall grass. Jack paused on the porch, looking back once more at the attic window, where the last rays of light caught the glass and made it glow like a living ember. "Funny thing," he said, almost to himself. "I thought we were building a business. Turns out we were just trying to build something that lasts." Ray closed the door behind them. "We did," he said, "and maybe that's enough." As they walked down the path toward the truck, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the soft creak of the porch swing and the faint smell of oil paint. The house behind them stood still, proud and patient, its windows shining in the dusk. It no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like remembrance, and somewhere deep within its walls, beneath the attic, beneath the wood and plaster, and years gone by, the heartbeat of what they had restored went on, steady and quiet, like a promise kept. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out the other stories waiting for you here, and share this video with someone who loves powerful tales like this one.